Hello, my name is Arthur Holland Michel, and I am a senior fellow at the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs. This episode of the Carnegie Council podcast is brought to you in collaboration with the Peace Research Institute Oslo as part of its Regulaire project. Regulaire is a multi-year research initiative about the integration of drones and other emerging technologies into everyday life. I am incredibly excited to be joined today by Will Knight. Will is a senior writer for Wired magazine, where he covers artificial intelligence in all its many guises. Will's reporting on AI is meticulous, preemptive, and I think most importantly in this day and age, level-headed. He's beaming in today from Cambridge, Massachusetts. Will, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Arthur. I'm very pleased to be here.
So why don't you just tell us a little bit more about what you actually do?
Yeah, that's a great question. I like that. And I mean, it sort of comes a little bit around to the question of what AI is, right? And my beat is AI. And, you know, I've actually been writing about it for over a decade, I guess long before it was as interesting as it is now, because I was kind of fascinated by it as this sort of scientific endeavor, this idea of advancing machine intelligence, which is really sort of tied to the history of computing. But, you know, more latterly, obviously AI has become this enormous phenomenon in the tech industry. It's just sort of, I think of it as a bit akin to software itself in the way that it's sort of transforming the whole tech industry and any industry that's touched by technology. And, you know, you were asking, I think at one point what the kind of thesis of my beat was, and I think I try to sort of focus as much as possible on the most important questions. I think when it comes to AI, the most important ramifications of the technology and how it touches upon the most important things I can think of, which I think often does come down to this sort of idea of the power of particular companies, international relations, you know, the rights of individuals. And it really feels very much like this is a moment where this technology is really tied up in those things. It's such a pervasive, such an important technology, but it is very much kind of tied to issues of power, influence, and rights. I think that's a really important thing. And I think there are a lot of people who do a great job of reporting on those things, and I guess I kind of balance my time by sort of between looking at some of the sort of fundamental advances, and I try and be strategic about what the really important impacts are, because I do think it's important to try and understand especially right now, like the technology itself, like how it works. And that's one of the most challenging things right now, you know, this in 2023, because we're seeing some sort of crazy stuff unfold.
I mean, you know, when you say you've been writing about AI for 10 years, that really makes you old hat in this space. I mean, it really makes you a veteran in like the truest sense of the word. And so I was wondering if you could share what the landscape of AI was like when you first started writing about it.
Yeah, so when I first started writing about it, it was really when I came out of college and I joined a magazine called New Scientist in the UK, which is a very, you know, as you would imagine, is very focused on developments in science. And I was part of the technology team there and keen to write about AI because I think partly because it was something that had always fascinated me, or I know that it was something that always fascinated me. And it was kind of in the doldrums in those days. You know, it was one of these AI winters, really, where I remember buying a textbook people would have in grad school or in undergrad on AI, and neural networks were like a small chapter in it that's kind of, you know, run over very quickly. At the same time, you know, even going back then, there was starting to be some very interesting things happen because of advances in computing and the internet. So you were starting to see things, some early machine learning stuff like Bayesian machine learning, transforming things like, you know, spam filtering, which is kind of an amazing phenomenon. We take it for granted now, but like the idea of how machines actually try to quite capably understand what's going on in an email and filter out the ones that that are bad or a spam was kind of something that people would try to do by hand, and then they started to do machine learning. So it was pretty much kind of a bit of a backwater, although there was this big, internet and technology company boom happening.
Would you say that there are any continuities, though, between then and now? Like, what has stayed the same about either the technology or the way people talk about it or the way it's sort of presented to the world?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think the truth is that AI is really just tied up in computer science, right? Advances in computer science are often just indistinguishable from what people might call AI. And you definitely had moments like, I remember, Deep Blue happening then. So there's the chess computer that beat Kasparov.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I remember talking to the people who built it, and I interviewed Kasparov. It was great fun. And, they built this, they had custom silicon to try and do this very old-fashioned way of looking ahead as much as possible, but doing some sort of more clever heuristics around it. But it was, I think, one of the things that you will see if you go back then and even way before is that the understanding of AI is often kind of a misunderstanding. Like the way it's presented is very much, it's often the case that when people talk about AI, they talk about it as if it's something that is becoming more generally like a person, more generally capable. And it's always been the case that you've carved off these small capabilities. Same thing with IBM Watson taking on Jeopardy, or AlphaGo, AlphaZero, right? It can do these specific things. But when people see that, I mean, we're very hardwired as a species to see intelligence in other things. And so we naturally say, oh, I mean, you look at the reporting around Deep Blue, and you could go back to many, many previous generations before I was, working on the beat. Like, you'll see the way people talk about AI as if it's like some giant brain that is going to take over everything. And that's the same right now, even with this generative AI stuff like ChatGPT, people are extrapolating, and it's understandable in each instance, and it's perhaps particularly understandable with ChatGPT and so on. But it is often taking something that you see and then extrapolating in your mind, like what is actually capable, and what and missing what the limitations and the problems of the technology are, which are often very manifold.
The reason I ask is because I've been covering similar things, drones and AI and other emerging technologies for about the same amount of time. And I've noticed something very recursive about the way these technologies are discussed. And, an example of that is that as long as you or I have been working in this space, people have been talking about how the technology is moving at unprecedented speeds, or that we are in a moment of unprecedented technological transformation, that things are accelerating in an unprecedented way, as though there is no precedent. But we've been talking about these unprecedented happenings for what feels like an unusually long time. And so, I wonder if, given what you have just pointed out, you feel like there is or isn't anything specifically different about these past 12 or so months. Has something changed?
Yeah, that is a wonderful question. And I think that's kind of the heart of what so many people are trying to figure out and I think to some degree, I don't know, right? Because I think that's the reality. People don't know. And that's what's unsettling a lot of people. I do have, I think probably because I've been around like you, running about it for a long time, often from a sort of outsider perspective, I do have a hunch that there's a lot more that is not, that it has to be achieved, and is not going to suddenly just fall into everybody's laps in terms of full, whatever you want to call it, human level intelligence. And I think when you do sort of look carefully at the technology, when you look at what this is, where it's like predicting the next word, and I think it's important to often to go back to the original idea of AI, artificial intelligence as a discipline, and that was creating human-like intelligence, right? And if you look at human intelligence, which is the only, to be like, no matter what the sort of people who are very sort of slavish about the computer science approach, and really the human intelligence is the only model we have. And if you look at evidence from cognitive science and linguistics, all these different fields, neuroscience, there's so much we don't know, and there's so much these models cannot do and don't do. So there is a lot that's missing. There's a ton that's missing, and there's a ton that's problematic, and there's more and more that's sort of coming out as I do this reporting. You chip away at these models, you see they are weird and quirky in some very fascinating and problematic ways if you're trying to do something that's going to be so generally useful. At the same time, I mean, I think it is fair to say that what happened in the last year sort of blew everybody's socks off, because there were these things that we thought for a long time, we don't know how to do that. And this technology specifically, this machine learning, deep learning approach does not lead to that. And so it was very surprising to a lot of people and kind of unsettling to say, oh, well, you just increase the volume of data and the amount of compute, and lo and behold, some of these things happen. But I think, again, going back to the sort of extrapolation, like people even within the field are extrapolating massively, saying, and this is really the phenomenon. They'll point to this, say, well, there's been this progress, so it's going to continue, and it's going to reach superhuman levels. But I don't know that that's really follows. I mean, if you think about, like, I think even OpenAI has been saying there's not much more maybe performance we can get out of just scaling up. So we have to look at other things, which would suggest that it's not going to continue like that. And also, when there are things missing, there are things missing that don't seem like, maybe that if you just do more and more, it shakes out. It like suddenly gets able to do all this stuff. But I wouldn't bet on that. And I think it is fundamentally appealing to kind of believe that we're on this kind of cusp of this once in forever moment where we're building something that's going to become sort of superhuman, or human level. But I do sort of suspect there may be a lot more twists in that, and it's just not quite as straightforward as we're being led to believe, or people are kind of worrying in some cases.
I guess, though, it's undeniable that something that has changed in these last 12 or so months is just the number of people who are sort of directly interacting with AI. Would you say that's fair? And if so, is that a significant change in the sort of history?
Well, I mean, it's an interesting question. I think there's a lot of people interacting with these language models, and that's kind of a different modality, a different way of interacting that is incredibly powerful and incredibly affecting. Like, using language is just, I mean, it's fundamental to how we communicate. So the idea of communicating with machines in a more advanced way of doing that is a big deal, and that is kind of new. I mean, people have been using AI and machine learning for going back many years, right? It's been kind of increasingly creeping into products and services and so on. I think it is this idea of having something that can actually seemingly converse in languages, and everybody being aware of it. I mean, yeah, like everyone is talking about ChatGPT, but it is also, I don't want to downplay the importance, because that's extraordinary. We didn't think that it was possible, and from the very beginnings, like, there's no idea that. I mean, some of the sort of winters of AI were realizing that it wasn't, that language was too difficult, and so being able to do this much is pretty incredible. But I do also think it's interesting if you look at the perception of AI, right, and the way language works. Language relies on us, you and me, having this idea of this intelligence behind the screen, behind the other person's eyes, right? And we don't have proof of that, but you have this interaction, and language is predicated. It works because we have this mental model of another intelligence, and it really feeds into this feeling of that. So I think the other thing is that, compared to, say, Deep Blue or AlphaZero or something, ChatGPT is that much more affecting, and in terms of that cycle, I think it feeds that idea of there is something very alive here, or something seemingly intelligent, right? Even more than previous instances. So it's a challenging time to kind of try and make sense of it, because I think there are big developments. It's undeniable. At the same time, it's tricky when those developments are being portrayed as the brink of AGI. I just don't know that's quite.
Yeah, I mean, the artificial general intelligence or the sort of artificial super intelligence discourse that you're referring to has, as many people have pointed out, been a major distraction. But part of the reason it's so fascinating to hear you talk about the affecting nature of this sort of new generation of AI tools and the new scale at which people are being affected by their direct interactions with these tools is that would suggest that there could be a major impact in the way AI ethics is sort of framed and discussed and popularized as an integral piece of sort of AI more broadly. And so I was wondering, with that in mind, if you've noticed any change or evolution in the way AI ethics or regulations are being discussed, the way people talk about it, if the vocabulary has changed, or if sort of the mindset of AI ethics is different compared to, say, a few years ago.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think it's completely been sort of flipped upside down in a way in the last year, because all of a sudden you have a lot of people, and there were always some people talking about superintelligence and existential risk, and now you have a lot of people talking about that and talking to governments about it. So I feel like you have this kind of almost split in the AI ethics field, where you have people who have been worried about bias and the way these tools can be used for influence campaigns or misinformation, suddenly being pushed aside by people who are talking about long-term risks, which are predicated on this idea of AGI and ASI superintelligence. And it's I feel that's been quite a disruptive thing, and I think that's still sort of we're in the process of figuring out how that works, where that goes. I mean, you have like the British government is doing this AI summit, big international summit, and much of the focus is going to be on sort of the existential long-term risks. And I think a lot of people are worrying that the short-term issues and maybe some of the things you could actually put companies to or hold them to account on are being pushed to one side. So I think that is a real problem potentially. And I mean, talking about we're talking about how common it is for people to interact with this AI in the form of things like ChatGPT, and I think that there are emerging issues which are kind of maybe going to be more related to this new wave of technology that aren't this long-term existential ones, but we may be missing. And things like just the very fact that interacting with a language model, can influence the way people think. Like, you talk to another person, your views, if you test someone, can be slightly shifted by that conversation. And if people are holding very similar conversations with machines, it is possible to sway them. And I think that's a really important thing that we're not seeing discussed very much. So you have these, models out there conversing with people, and it's all a bit of a wild west right now. But you could see how companies might have an interest in using those to put forward a particular position or to subtly adjust people's views. Governments, of course, performing sort of very subtle misinformation campaigns that don't even feel like that. If you have Alexa and Alexa tells you about this product, but it's actually really convincing just because it's been programmed to know how to be very convincing. That sort of thing are going to be I think going to be a big thing. And I do think some of those short-term risks are being not very clear, because we've got this kind of shouting about long-term existential dangers, which are obviously people are going to focus on most, because you would.
Yeah, I've been thinking, for example, about these new AI celebrity influencer avatars that the company Meta has developed. And now you have someone who looks and speaks like the model Kendall Jenner, doling out dating advice and potentially advice on other aspects of our, sort of the closest and most intimate and most human parts of our lives. And in that sense, there are some, pretty immediate concerns that really don't have anything to do with whether that chatbot will someday I don't know, get access to the
Yeah.
nuclear codes, right?
Exactly. Yeah, totally. Yeah, exactly. I mean, like the one of the things that has made ChatGPT so popular is that they did this reinforcement learning with human feedback, this process of having people use it and then say, well, that seemed like a good answer, or that seemed like a convincing answer. And there's no reason why you can't train through the same process models to be convincing about all sorts of things. If you want them to present a particular position, sell a certain product. And I mean, like we're holding a conversation here because this is so fundamental to how humans communicate and interact and think. It's our use of language and our use of expression through language. If you have machines that start to do that in a really, really engaging way, it can definitely mess with people a lot. I mean, I think that it's interesting seeing ChatGPT have this audio, voice, and vision capabilities, and there was some blow up on Twitter because people were saying, "Oh, it's just like talking to a therapist," right? I think it was someone within OpenAI, but therapists are trained for a particular reason. They're not just language models trained on God knows what on Reddit, and it's yeah. So I think it's a lot of like we're kind of just playing with stuff that's could be quite powerful, and as you say, like in ways that don't have anything to do with sort of existential dangers, getting the nuclear codes, which I mean nobody can disprove that that's going to happen, but nobody can. That is a worry for sure, I think.
Something else that's been very repetitive about the AI space for all of these years that we've been in it, and I don't know, personally it feels like a lot more than a decade. Maybe you feel that way too.
Yeah.
But something that does feel really repetitive is this notion of like needing regulations and being on the cusp of having regulations, or that this urgent push for rules and guardrails. And that has always been like just a couple of years on the horizon. And I wonder if you feel like we are actually likely to see rules with teeth anytime soon. And if not, why? What are these obstacles that keep AI regulations on this infinite horizon?
That's interesting. I don't feel like we're going to see hugely meaningful regulations. I think that the European Union is proposing slightly more stringent ones. So much of what we're seeing around regulations to me just feels like theater. It's like people want to say, oh, I'm doing something about it because it's so important. I think you can't forget that the US government, right, will see this technology and they see potentially something that could transform the economy and provide an enormous advantage to the economy, to their different industries, to their military. They are not going to be very keen to regulate it. So all this stuff where they're reacting to sort of the public reaction and saying, we're going to get people in and have them, agree to these voluntary rules and whatnot. But it doesn't, I don't think they have very much interest in regulating it at all. I think that's kind of, it's the opposite. They want this to take off. And you can see similar things happened with autonomous cars, autonomous driving. They've been very, very reluctant to regulate that much in the US because they want to see that industry take off. And I mean, it's kind of understandable from this sort of government policy, capitalist, objective perspective, but it isn't really tied up in, or isn't really make sense that they would want to regulate that so much. So I'm not super optimistic that we're going to see very meaningful regulations. Yeah, and I think that's probably the reason.
In that sense, would you say that AI is different from other spaces and industries that have been regulated, like, I don't know, aviation or the motor industry? And I guess on the tail end of that, often what we hear is that it is incredibly complicated to govern AI, that AI is just far too complex. And I wonder if there's actually an evidentiary basis for that, given that we have in the past succeeded in regulating some fairly sophisticated and complex and sort of multifaceted technologies.
Yeah, I think that's true to some degree, that it's probably closer to those industries, and that you could certainly come up with much more stringent or much more meaningful regulation. I think that it is a moment where you've got this kind of. I'm not an expert on regulating sort of different industries. I don't doubt that there are challenges to doing it with AI that are kind of unique, but as you say, I mean, there are pretty significant challenges for doing it. It's like biotechnology and other complex, fast-moving industries. But you do have a moment where you have governments being told by all of the experts they could probably, or a ton of experts, that this technology is this is like generational shift, and it's just going to change everything. The last thing they want to do is pump the brakes on it and put too many controls on it, especially in the US. So I think that affects it.
Yeah, I mean, there's something to be, I guess, asked there about whether that need to balance sort of strategic needs and the safety of one's citizens is a unique balance in AI, or whether perhaps there are maybe other forces that are driving this notion that regulating AI is going to preclude benefiting from its its possibilities.
Yeah, I mean, so that's the narrative, isn't it? That it's somehow unique. Yeah, I mean, I don't know that it's not unique, but I don't see that it necessarily is either. I mean, and I think there are certainly a lot of lobbying forces, huge numbers of lobbying forces at play here. I mean, like very, very rich and powerful companies are trying to preempt regulation, and like touching on your own work in sort of use of drones and military technology, it also does feel like there is this kind of unusual climate of feeling that this technology has an enormous strategic, whether it's like intelligence or military technology potential. And I think that does weigh quite heavily, even if it's not like really out there in the public discussion. But I think that weighs a lot on the way that the government's thinking about it.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring that up, because the military space is perhaps where this ethical tension is most fraught. And you published a phenomenal feature this year, just what was it, a couple of months ago, on autonomous military technologies. I would recommend everyone go out and read that story. But just for our purposes today, can you tell us a little bit about that story? What were your main conclusions? And I guess part of what I want to ask is also, what was it like to actually come face to face with these technologies?
Yeah, thank you for saying that about the story. I started off actually a couple of years ago. I was interested in this topic because I felt that a lot of the reporting around it, when it was actually mostly about Maven, right, this Google project, I thought it was very knee-jerk, and I thought technology is not really that black and white when it comes to its use in defense or in the military. And so I wanted to learn more about that, and I spent a lot of time trying to sort of build connections and learn more and more. And I became very interested in the sort of this Navy application of the technology because I hadn't had that much attention. I thought it was also moving quite quickly because there's this idea of using autonomous systems, often low-cost, cheap autonomous systems, to improve and increase the visibility and responsiveness of forces. This idea of maritime awareness, and it was actually being tested in the Gulf of Oman by the U.S. Fifth Fleet because they've been given this kind of license to test some of these technologies. And diving into it was really fascinating because there's a lot of different forces at play often within military or defense and related circles. There are a lot of different views on what technology is going to be important and isn't. And there are plenty of people who think AI is not as important as a lot of people who believe it's going to be really transformational. But it is interesting if you look at the history of military conflict and technology related to that. There are these enormously important moments. Technology is just so fundamental to the military capabilities and power and success, and has been over history. So he's very tied up. There's a really, really strong incentive to try and be on top of the latest technologies that are going to be meaningfully important. It doesn't mean that the coolest thing is going to be what the most exciting thing out of the tech industry is going to be important. But there is also this moment where technologies that have been private sector commercial technologies are suddenly becoming more applicable to the military sphere, and you can see this in Ukraine. I mean, in your writings on drones, you know this very well. That we see this drop in the cost of drones enormously over the last several years, and it's really changing the nature of a lot of conflicts. It's really massively important, and that's not AI specifically, but is related to AI. And so you have there are a lot of forces at play, and there is this idea that's sort of gaining currency, I think, and it's kind of quite appealing to people that autonomy and AI is going to be a way to have a military edge. There is also a strong incentive in some parts of the Pentagon to put this idea out there that they're racing to adopt AI, especially in a maritime situation, so that you create some doubts in the minds of America's near-peer adversaries. And the obvious one is China. Everybody's kind of obsessed with that and obsessed with the idea of some potential conflict. I mean, it's kind of alarming to me how hawkish often I feel like Washington has become about China. And you also, reading military history, you see how the race to adopt technologies can sometimes sort of become a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? And that's one of the things that and I'm no expert on this. I'm sort of trying to learn. There's a lot of people who are experts on military history far more than I am, but I was trying to understand it, and it does strike you like, if you try to sort of race to adopt this stuff and to deploy it, almost feels like an end into itself. But yeah, so I mean, I think that there's a lot more complexity to the question of AI and its use in military domains. As you've written about this, you've written excellent stuff on this. It's not like a slam dunk that it works or is useful at all. Often it just isn't. At the same time, there's this kind of big sort of momentum shift in that direction, which I think is going to meaningfully, along with things like the much cheaper cheaper systems, autonomous systems, is going to probably transform the makeup of different militaries. You see a lot of this investment that different countries are making, and it's a response to what's happened in Ukraine when you saw these cheap systems changing the nature of how one might expect that conflict to go. When you had these cheap drones at the beginning, that changed very after a while. But it's interesting. I mean, I still feel like I'm learning a lot about that, and I feel like it's very much I feel like it's still really an open question, like how useful AI really is and how quickly that will be used. And one of the key questions, I think, is, if we look at AI being deployed anywhere, whether it's autonomous systems or these chatbots, when you do it in really critical situations, like what is the engineering around that? Because it's not just a question, you can't just put these machine learning systems out there and see what happens, because they don't always behave predictably. That's like, it's just fundamental to their nature. So you have to engineer to try and deal with that. And I think it should be a real worry that's an issue, because it's just not a known, it's an emerging form of engineering. It's not really well known. I would actually expect that the US might be very, very good at developing the way to do that more relatively reliably. But I would worry about a lot of other countries that maybe aren't as well resourced or racing to sort of, try and find parity. I think that picture is quite concerning.
Something that I've always appreciated about your reporting is that you've picked up on sort of questions and perspectives that maybe aren't picked up by the, shall we say, the sort of discursive mean of the AI space. And so I was just wondering, for the purposes of our listeners, if you could share what you think are some of the areas or questions in this space that you feel like we should be paying more attention to. And in particular, if you see any ethical questions here that perhaps haven't yet found a satisfying answer?
Yeah, I think I'm glad you asked that. I think that one thing that's sort of come up to me and I find interesting, and I don't know the answer to this, and I just think it's very interesting, is I've heard people who I very much respect in the AI space who are, surprised by the capabilities of some of these models, but point out limitations, things like they don't mimic kind of a sense of self, right? They don't really have a consistent one, and they don't have any sort of goals. They don't set their own goals and make their own sort of objectives. And I've heard people just sort of ask the question like, well, maybe do we want to do that? Do you want to build these models? Because if you think about what we're doing, right, you're trying to build something that is not purely at an abstract intellectual. Well, what is the intelligence we're trying to recreate, especially with this sort of like just learning from human behavior, is human-like intelligence. I think we have a lot of problems with very intelligent humans, right? You look at the world now; it's really dismaying, and I sort of wonder, like, is there some point to be, like, when all this discussion about existential risk, it's sort of you just wonder, like, a bit of. I wonder, like, the mechanics of how we're building this stuff. Is that the smartest way to do it? Like, just try and, maybe that. I guess we don't know another way to try and make things very smart. And as I've said before, we don't have a model that isn't human intelligence. But it doesn't feel like we're asking much about just the basics of that when it comes to developing systems that might behave in ways that we don't like or that are problematic. And that's not an existential risk. That's just sort of saying, how do you avoid mimicking some of these things that maybe we don't want to have in systems? And I don't know. It's a funny question because, like, I don't want to feel like a Luddite who's saying maybe we don't do this or that with the technology. But I don't know. I think a lot of the discussion around this is become sort of a bit performative, where people are talking about existential risk. And I want to get more into, like, what does that mean? Like, okay, there are some papers where they look at models, how they try to deceive people. Okay, is that interesting? Is that actually really a problem? Is that something you can easily fix? Like, some of the detail of this misbehavior of these systems, I think, is going to be very interesting and should be focused on a lot more. Yeah, I guess that's one of those are sort of some of the main things. I do think that the way that these models can sort of influence people subtly, or just sort of developing a system. It's not intelligent as I would describe intelligent, but they can mimic conversation relentlessly and really effectively towards a particular end. Feels like it could be a pretty settling thing to just sort of build more and more of them. So I think that needs a bit more exploration discussion. One other thing, I think, when you have companies going around saying, I've got the most powerful technology in history potentially, but they won't make it possible for people to really examine it, look at it. There isn't much transparency. That feels very weird to me. I think, like, that doesn't feel like science. That feels problematic. And you're not saying, I think there are a lot of brilliant people who could try and understand some of the behaviors here that people are kind of worrying about. And I feel that that's a real mistake. And when you've got companies sort of driving the discussion around regulation and saying, well, we think there should be, a national register that you have to have permission to do it, but it's only going to include us. And then we won't reveal how this stuff works. That feels wrong. I think as a society, I think we should be asking for especially if it's, it's this powerful and fundamental a technology, we should really be trying to understand it more it feels like people are just throwing things out there for the profit motive.
I'd imagine that many of our listeners might find this barrage of questions and considerations and uncertainties to be pretty daunting. I know that from my perspective, I find it pretty daunting as well, as I'm sure you do too, perhaps at the best or at the worst of times. And so I just wanted to ask finally, what is it that sort of gets you out of bed and through the day? What is it that either motivates you or that ideally what you're optimistic about? What gives you a joyful sense of the future, if anything?
Yeah, that's a good, it is a bit overwhelming at the moment because there are so many questions, it feels sort of unsettling. I think it is important to remember, going back to like the first question you were talking about, like covering this beat, looking at it early on, that this is a pretty sort of an incredible moment. Honestly, having a technology that can do something as general seeming as these models can do is something to be really celebrated, and I feel lucky to be sort of like witnessing that quite close up. Actually, I do feel that is amazing, and one of the things that's interesting is like talking to people who are really embedded in the field. They often say, "Oh, it's kind of amazing to think that my kid's going to grow up where there's these sorts of tools. Whether you think of them as intelligent, whether they may, in time be indistinguishable from some kind of intelligence, is kind of crazy to think about that being something that they'll grow up with, and that is interesting, right? You have something that can converse with people so convincingly and often usefully that it is a fundamentally new technology. So, I mean, I think that is pretty amazing. It is pretty striking to be at that moment in history. And in terms of being optimistic, I mean, I try to stay optimistic when it comes to everything. Yeah, I don't know. That's interesting. I think that's probably the thing that keeps me most optimistic, is just thinking that we're at this pretty incredible moment, and let's hope that there's a lot of positive outcomes that can be sort of wrung from it, even if it's going to be a slightly sort of unnerving, unsettling period for a while.
I think certainly I might add that one of the things that keeps me optimistic is that there are folks like yourself who are really like on top of this and holding those, creating these technologies and using these technologies to task about these sorts of questions. Will continue to do so while hopefully practicing an enormous amount of self-care. But I'd say that's a great note to end on. So I will just finish by saying that, Will, this has been a phenomenally fascinating conversation for me, and I'm just very grateful for your time today.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you for having me. It's been really fun.
Thank you for listening to this Carnegie Council podcast. For more podcasts, videos, and articles exploring the most critical issues at the intersection of ethics and international affairs, please visit us at carnegiecouncil.org. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and subscribe to our channel on YouTube at Carnegie Council. Thank you for the privilege of your time.